if I may ask, speaking of 9/11, and interestingly, today is 9/11.
Oh my God.
Can you say something about the current preoccupation of the U.S. with Iran? What actually are the issues that is troubling the American administration?
Well, I try to be careful, analytic about it. Well, the official story right now is that the Americans, perhaps for good reason, are fearful that the Iranian government is trying to build or acquire atomic weapons. And this is the present focus of all these rhetoric and pressures and disagreements and confrontation. But I think the story goes back, in time. For too long, the American government has been unwilling and incapable of engaging Iran in any constructive way. Iran has a lot of responsibility, and good reasons. There are serious historical roots for this to have happened. Last year I was in a meeting with former Speaker of the House, Gingrich, and he was saying how Iran had misbehaved towards the United States and almost depicted the United States as an aggressor. And I said, wait a minute. You have to look back a little bit more into history. What did you do in Iran in the early 1950s? And you have to understand that these stories have two sides. You cannot see, and you supported also an aggressor to Iran, Saddam Hussein, when they were at war. So you must understand why Iran is so special about the United States. But the only way to solve this is through diplomacy, through engagement. I don't really get the reason why the United States has not taken advantage of some windows of opportunity in the past. After 9/11, by the way, and this I say from the news, I think Iran was highly cooperative with the United States when they went after the Talibanese regime. And I think that was a precious moment in which the U.S. and Iran could have started a new relationship. And that didn't happen. And despite this cooperation, Iran was named as part of the axis of evil. So I'm not surprised that Iran, well beyond the peculiarities of the present president, Iranian president, has got terribly paranoid about the United States. Unfortunately, what at least a sector of the administration speaks about Iran really tends to confirm the idea that the Iranian government should be paranoid about the United States. My hope is that nothing is really going to happen within the next few months that remain to this administration, and that hopefully, the next administration will have a fresh look not only at the situation of Iran, but also about the situation with Russia and other major players, and that eventually the international community will work out an agreement with Iran so that Iran really abides by the non-proliferation treaty. I don't think Iran wants to be an outlaw in the international system, and with the proper incentives and assurances and safeguards, I think it is achievable. But yes, you are right. At some moments we have been in a rather difficult and dangerous situation.
No, just to follow up on that, one of the most amazing discussions we had in Vienna at the IEA meetings was the reluctance of some of the nuclear weapon states to acknowledge that they have to fulfill their obligations under the NPT and gradually disarm and not modernize their nuclear arsenals. Do you think that the P5 now realize that they too have an obligation under the NPT?
Well, unfortunately, Kishore, from the time we had those discussions a few months ago to today, the situation is worse. I mean, I am very worried about what's happening between Russia and the United States. They used to have and continue to have cooperation on nuclear issues. And events like the ones we have seen during the last month are having a negative effect on that cooperation. And I think this is going to give a good reason to the hawks in both sides that rather than reducing their arsenals, they should pursue their programs of modernization. So again, I am hopeful that the next U.S. administration will rethink seriously their approach to Russia. And probably that will coincide with a decrease in the price of oil, and also that will make the Russian leaders to moderate their newly acquired arrogance to deal with some issues. If Russia and the U.S. don't lead in this matter, then I think it will be impossible for the others to move, the other three, and I think then the likelihood of seeing more countries becoming nuclear weapon equipped will be much higher.
So Astrid, Prasenjit, and so Astrid. No, Astrid over there. No.
I'm Dr. Astrid Dominguez from the Lee Kuan Yew School. Would you please comment on the current and future role of Asian leadership in a globalized world? Specifically, when you look at challenges such as climate change, or international financial regulation, non-proliferation, trafficking of women and children, any of these challenges, which Asian countries do you see playing a lead role now in resolving or dealing with some of these challenges, and which other Asian countries should be playing a greater role in the future? Thank you.
Well, you know, I think all Asian countries should play a role through the multilateral institutions to which all of them belong. But it's obvious that given the structure of governance of these institutions, sometimes it's very hard to play a more significant role. So it's like a catch-22.
You mean the UN Security Council?
Well, and also the international financial institutions, the WTO, and so on. So it's like a catch-22. I think at some point, the international community has to take more seriously the task of adapting these institutions to the realities of the early 21st century. Because if that doesn't happen, then eventually these institutions will become irrelevant, and probably there will be other proxies emerging here and there, trying to do what these institutions should be doing. And this, of course, is not a criticism of the institutions, because the institutions, well, are the building, you know. What we are talking about are the countries that help to create those institutions, and that should also lead, or help to lead, in their transformation. But it is evident that in Asia, there are two countries that have to have a special responsibility. And these are the two giants, you know, China and India. And somehow there's a paradoxical situation with the two countries. I would say, let me take the case of China, because China is being a much more active participant in globalization, has acquired even its sheer size, because of its sheer size and its interaction with the world, has acquired a very special situation in the world stage. Now, everybody sees to China. China has a new great power, which, if you look at the sheer numbers, is true. And yet, it is also true that China is a very poor country, right? China's GDP per capita is the 120th of the world. Its per capita GDP is 1/30th of that of the United States. But its sheer size is so important that China is expected to take responsibilities consistent with its sheer size. But of course, China's capabilities are not the same as that of other rich countries. And this is a very difficult situation, because more and more I see pressure on China. And Chinese leaders trying to say, well, not yet. I cannot do that because I'm not ready for that, because I have to grow richer before I can take up those responsibilities. And one example, of course, you mentioned the question of climate change. And it is very hard to think how China could assume the responsibilities that other countries are expecting China to assume in the next stage of the Kyoto, or whatever you call it, agreement. So this is a very tough problem. And right now, my sense is that there is simply no dialogue about it. I mean, they are not really talking seriously about how a country like China or how a country like India will live up to their new importance in the world stage, taking into account that they don't have the same capabilities that the already rich countries have. And this is going to be a very difficult process in the next few years. I think a lot of imagination, accommodation, and leadership will be needed if we are going to have constructive solutions and not outright confrontation to address some of the global issues that you were mentioning.
We have about 20 minutes to go with already 4 questions. Prasenjit and Gavin Sitaram. So, Prasenjit.
Yes. Thank you for your earlier comments. I found them very interesting, and specifically referring to the financial crisis. I am, by the way, Prasenjit Dwara, the Director of Humanities and Social Science Research. But I happen to be a historian, and from the perspective of the historian, I'm puzzled by the attention I understand is a financial one, but how and why it is not connected in a way that you sort of did connect it, but I would like you to tell us more. The connection with a broader economic problem of production and consumption and the transformation of this relationship as a result of globalization, the moving out of production, the continuing increase in consumption, and so on. And you had said that this globalization now is giving us some hope. But to begin with, is it to some extent that produced the problem? Or maybe what is happening is that there's an acceleration of both crisis and hope. Could you reflect on some of those?
Well, I will only grant, I'm not so sure that if we dissect the problem of the financial crisis, we can really validate your statement in the sense that we are in this problem because of globalization. No, what I think has happened on the one hand is that the world economy has had incredible dynamism in recent years. And part of the explanation of that dynamism has to do with the growth of international trade and investment. And that has been a good thing. And what I was saying is that countries like the United States have not been particularly prudent in their macroeconomic management, which is a national choice. And probably the countries that have had large surpluses in, for example, in Asia, were so traumatized by the Asian crisis of the late 1990s that they ended up not having, they tried to have too much of a good thing by running these large surpluses. But that's again a matter of national choice. How do you do your macroeconomic policies? Problem is that in one country you end up having a practically negative national savings rate, and other countries have decided to sacrifice present consumption for the sake of building, huge international reserves and having their economies driving mostly by exports rather than domestic consumption. But that's a decision in those countries. In principle, there is nothing that could avoid having better macroeconomic policy coordination. And here we go again to the question of global public goods. How do you achieve collective action so that you adjust without making a loose situation for some of the members of the community? Because if the US says, okay, I will move to be more prudent in my fiscal policy, and but I don't want to suffer too much from that. And therefore, if you move a little bit in the direction of relying less in the exchange rate policy that you have, and more on your domestic consumption, then maybe we can correct these global imbalances without making each other suffer through the process of adjustment. I think that's the problem at its root. But I think the other side of this story is that this problem would have been much worse without the resilience that the global economy has given us.
And the mic.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on the earlier conversations.
And you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Anne Fleury, I'm the director of the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Kuan School. I'd like to follow up on the conversation on global governance and pull together a few of the themes that you've been working on. I completely agree with your analysis about the American fiscal situation, which I think means that for the next few years, America is going to have to be fairly inward-looking. It's got a lot of repair work to do inside. The European Union is focused primarily on region building within the European Union. Reports like yours on the IAEA
I think you are right. I mean, the emerging powers at some point, and this is what I was raising about China, have to find a way to lead more. But that, leadership takes something very simple. You have to take responsibility. And this is the big problem with the provision of global public goods. That countries have to recognize that at least for a while, others are going to free ride on your own actions and initiatives. And that is a negative incentive for countries to move. So the Chinese would say, or the Indians, I'm not going to move because I want the Americans or the Europeans to lead and therefore to pay first before I move. But then we go into a deadlock. And the most recent and dramatic example is given by the Doha round, which in principle, the emerging countries are right. We launched this round because we wanted to bring the agricultural sector into the multilateral trading system, just as the other sectors have gone. And correct these crazy policies about subsidies in the US and these crazy policies of subsidies and market access in the European Union and also in Japan. And they said, you promised me that this was the round in which we were going to do this. And the truth of the matter is that what the Americans and the Europeans have put on the table has not lived up to the expectations that the international community had when the Doha round was launched. But they have put something on the table. So the question was whether we were going to close the round with what has been put on the table, which is not the dramatic change that people wanted, but it's something. And yet, some of the emerging powers, and in this case India, and ironically in the last episode supported by China, something that took everybody by surprise, wanted to take the chips and say, but we are not putting anything on the table, anything meaningful on the table. And in fact, on agriculture, I want to be totally exempted from any obligation. And this, I think, is wrong. It doesn't make any economic sense for India. I agree that in principle, the others should have put more and should have moved earlier. But it doesn't make any sense for India to take that position. And it's even worse to see China go and support India on that. I mean, China is a very open country, even on agriculture, relative to the others. So they have nothing to do with this issue. They were very passive players throughout the negotiation. So I think it was a massive mistake to come at the last moment and support India on this. I hope this experience will make them twice next time and say, okay, we have to be, because now the other guy saying, who are the culprits of the failure, which fundamentally is not true. I mean, the round has gone bad because of a lack of leadership from the part of the US and Europe, period. I mean, that's objectively the case. But now, before the war, India and China happened to be the bad boys in the picture. I think they made a terrible strategic mistake. But it's fixable.
Yeah, I think we have time for two quick questions. We have Gavin and Staram, and maybe Bernard, if you have time, we come to you. We're supposed to finish in 8 minutes. We've got to wait short, sharp questions.
Pretty sharp, but I have to give a little bit of background. Could we focus on Mexico for a minute, Professor Zedillo? and particularly the comparisons are often drawn between Mexico and the Philippines for obvious reasons. I'm interested in the church-state relationship, and if I could focus on just one specific issue. The fertility rate in Mexico is about replacement level right now, whereas in the Philippines it's about 50% above replacement. And there are obviously many factors, but the role of the Catholic Church is often cited as being one reason why the Philippines' fertilities remain relatively high. Could you comment on church-state relations in Mexico in relation to that, or in relation to any other things that perhaps came up during your presidency?
This may be the most difficult question.
Well, it's difficult because I don't really know the situation in the Philippines. But of course, I know the situation in Mexico. Yes, the majority of the population is Catholic. However, we have had a very strong separation between the church and the state since the middle of the 19th century. And even more, for many years, the Mexican state, for practical purpose, for legal purposes, didn't recognize the church. So it was even at the beginning an antagonic relationship, and then for a number of years was, accommodative situation. Only 13 or 14 years ago, there was a constitutional reform by which the state recognized all churches and gave them legal status, and the legal space to work normally. So I suspect that although the Mexican government, when they started to have these more active population policies in the 70s and 80s, particularly in the 70s, well, they knew the Catholic Church opinions, but they didn't have to deal formally with the church as such, but rather take into account that the population were Catholic. But I think the Mexican Catholic population is also a rather pragmatic, this is perhaps has to do with our previous religions, native religions, highly polytheist. So our syncretism, our Catholic syncretism, I think is different from other expressions of Catholicism. Actually, right now there's a big debate because for the first time, I think the federal district has adopted an abortion law, sort of under certain circumstances, legalizing the abortion, and the Catholic Church is being very vocal about it. But I don't see much resonance in public opinion at this point. So I would say I don't know how the relationship between the church and the state is in the Philippines, but I don't think this history of separation is as it is in Mexico.
Director for Institute of Water Policy at the Kuan School of Public Policy. In terms of the developmental agenda in Asian countries, I used to do some reports in Asian Development Bank and working with the Inter-American Development Bank. There's belief that there's a lot to learn from the Latin American countries. One specific question for you relating to yesterday's speech also with Michael Spence is, there's enormous wealth being created in Asia, and as you've rightly said, they're investing in papers in US and other economies, and they have not been rightly doing so perhaps. Why are they not investing it in their basic infrastructure in Asia? As you know, Asia is lagging behind in terms of basic services like even water and other services. What is it that they can learn from Latin American countries like Mexico and others in this regard?
Well, I wouldn't like Asian countries to learn a lot from Latin America, quite frankly.
Why not?
Because you have done much better than us. I tend to say the opposite. We have to learn from the Asian countries. I don't think you are to receive lessons from Latin America. I think we Latin Americans should pay closer attention, much closer attention to what has happened in Asia. and I say this here, and I say that in Mexico, and sometimes people don't like it when I say it, but I am absolutely convinced. No, you are investing much more than Latin American countries in general in infrastructure in Asia. To begin with, you have much higher domestic savings rates. And that means that you have much more resources that we have to invest in infrastructure. And that explains why growth rates are much higher in Asia than in Latin America. I think one of the Latin American diseases is that we tend to have savings rates as if we were rich. So this is a paradox, you know. And therefore we invest too little. So maybe there are some things that you would like about Latin America, but don't follow any of our advices to grow more or to have more infrastructure. Do exactly the opposite.
Ernesto, we have 1 minute. Can I take a quick question of the Dean of the Business School?
The excess plus information asymmetry leads to a bubble that leads to crisis. Periodically, the world has a crisis of this sort once every 10 years. The Latin American debt crisis, the Asian crisis, and now the American subprime. Where do you see in the next 10 years, and this is a question relevant to our retirement planning, where do you see, but it's serious. But in a way it's serious, where do you see is the next round of build-up of access, information asymmetry, and therefore crisis? It's something that if we can think about it early, maybe we can stop it.
And then we'll bring you back 10 years from now to check.
I would be extremely arrogant and stupid if I try to answer your question, you know. But I think, I mean, you are right. I mean, these things somehow are bound to happen in capitalism.
It always happens.
Yeah, and the only answer, I mean, has to do with something, a word that you say, information. I mean, if you don't want markets to fail, then you better make sure that you have the information provided in a non-asymmetric way. And because every time you have this crisis, you see that large sectors of the market were not really aware of what was happening in the market. And whenever you have transparency and full information, it's hard to have a crisis like this. So my bet would be, I mean, always to watch where is the market failing in providing the information for agents to act rationally based on good information. And when you see that failure, then you know that eventually something will happen.